Okay, let me call our meeting to order this evening, August 26, 2015. The time by our clock is 7 p.m. We have an abbreviated agenda tonight, but I would like to start the meeting as we always do by inviting everyone present to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, so let me welcome folks who are with us in the room this evening. What I'd like to do, our first agenda item is a presentation and a discussion with representatives from Northern Middlesex Council of Government relative to two items, a hazard mitigation plan and also discussion concerning a regional dispatch option that we're considering. So I want to invite representatives, Beverly Woods, who is the executive director, and I think is Jay going to join you or not?
Jay's going to join me for the second item.
Okay.
Solo on.
You want to handle the hazard mitigation plan first?
Yes.
Okay. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
I think you all received copies of the plan and the summary.
Yes.
And under the Hazard Mitigation Act of 2000, every community in the country is required to have a hazard mitigation plan in place in order to be eligible to receive certain types of FEMA grant funding. And the town of Tewksbury is very fortunate right now to have 4 projects with approved grant applications from FEMA to do some flood control and roadway drainage improvements across town. And in order for the town to be able to access these grant funds, we need to have the Board of Selectmen approve the hazard mitigation plan. We've been working on this plan with our 9 communities since 2011, and the plan has to be updated every 5 years. We had a planning team that we put together comprised of municipal staff across all 9 communities, and included public safety officials, the local planners, engineering and DPW staff, and the emergency managers in the community. We also solicited extensive input from residents and the business community and nonprofits and other stakeholders across the region. We had 1 public meeting in every community, and we had 2 public meetings in at different locations in the region on the draft plan once it was completed. The plan really looks at the types of natural hazards that your community is at risk of experiencing, the areas in town that are vulnerable to natural hazards, and then it outlines measures that every community can put in place that's appropriate for their community to mitigate natural hazards. That's preventing damage and loss of life from occurring should there be a natural hazard. It's not a response plan. It's sort of a planning ahead kind of plan. What can we do in advance of the natural hazard? We had to report in this plan the progress that was made on implementing measures in the last plan, and we're happy to report that every community made significant progress. There is an action plan at the end of this document that was put together based on a consensus building process with input from local officials in your community and municipal staff and the planning team. And we established the priorities that are in that action plan based on the cost of the project, the availability of funding, the political acceptance for the measures that are in there, and whether or not the action was actually doable over the next 5 years. So there are a number of projects. There are structural projects that look at correcting drainage and flooding problems across the region and in Tewksbury itself. There are prevention measures. In Tewksbury, the town has identified a need for having a backup pump and a generator for the East Street pump station, and install an emergency backup generators for the sewer pump stations, and those are in here as recommendations. Emergency service projects are included, and in Tewksbury, there was a need to install emergency generators at the water treatment plant and at some of the senior housing, so that is in there as a recommendation. And also property protection projects, one of the things that this committee decided was something important the communities could do going forward is to look at your municipal buildings to determine the snow loads for those buildings based on the experience of last winter, so that if we have another winter like last winter, it'll be clear to communities which roofs need special attention and when they need to be cleared off, etc. And then also looking at buildings in the municipality to identify the ones that don't currently meet seismic standards. This is an improvement that you would address as you made improvements to the building. It's not something you would take on as a sort of standalone item. And then there are also some things in there for public education and sort of making the public more aware of sort of the dangers of extreme temperatures and how they can address them or how to prevent flooding from impacting their property. So once the plan is adopted, we will meet with this planning team annually to sort of review each community's progress in implementing the measures going forward. It's important for me to tell you that you are not obligated to implement all of the measures that are in here. It's really a goal. And when it's time to renew the next plan, we'll go through each of the recommendations that were in here, identify those that have been implemented and those that haven't, and then the community can make a decision whether it's appropriate to carry forward the things that haven't been implemented or if they need to be sort of set aside because they turned out not to be fundable or feasible. So what we're asking this evening is that the Board of Selectmen vote to adopt the plan. So that's my Reader's Digest version. I'm happy to entertain any questions that you may have.
So let me ask you just two questions. For the benefit of those who will watch this tape or maybe read some of this discussion in the papers, can you just explain briefly the genesis of this obligation? It's prudent for us to do this regardless of any mandates, but there's, I believe, a connection to FEMA that puts us in a position where we have an obligation or potentially could be penalized in the negative.
There's a piece of federal legislation that was passed in 2000 called the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 that required that every community address hazard mitigation. Without this plan in place, the town is not eligible to apply for certain types of FEMA grant funding. So it's a good thing to do just to be proactive in terms of addressing natural hazards, but it's also a prudent thing to do in terms of maintaining the town's eligibility to receive federal grant money.
And all of the towns in the council government are participating in their individual plans, I assume?
Yes, they are, and I was in Tewksbury on Monday night, Rutherford last night, so you would be the third community to adopt the plan.
Terrific. And just one other question from me before I turn to my colleagues. Some of these areas or goals that we've established, there's potential for overlap with risk mitigation or risk consulting services that, for example, our property insurer might provide. You mentioned snow load on our roofs, or roofs, I should say, I guess. You know, those are things that often the risk control team from our property casualty insurer would provide some services for. So is there any kind of way to tie those things together and kind of advance the cause with respect to some of those other resources that focus on the same areas?
Absolutely, and a lot of the things that you'll see in here, I mean, there is the insurance angle, but there are things that your DPW department is looking to take on anyway. You know, they're responsible for addressing roadway flooding. And we all know what happened on River Road in the not too distant past. So there aren't a lot of measures in here that are high cost or that call for things that the town wouldn't normally be addressing. One of the other things that we recommend in here is that the town tie the hazard mitigation plan into their other planning initiatives, like your master planning process and your open space plan, because they really are all very interconnected.
Sure. All right, so before I ask my colleagues if they have any questions, Mr. Montour, do you have any color to add to this at all? No. You want us to be aware of? Okay. Questions on my left? Mr. Wentworth?
A quick one, because I'm always interested in benchmarking with different or Middlesex. Get Metcog here, I'm always interested in benchmarking with other communities. In terms of our mitigation issues and plans, how does that relate to other communities in northern Middlesex? Are we better off, are we a little worse off, are we sort of in the middle?
I think we're probably pretty typical of most communities, and we try to, you'll see in the plan that there are regional recommendations as well, because one of the things that's very obvious is, flooding on the Merrimack River isn't confined to one community, it's the entire river basin. So we've tried to encourage communities to work together cooperatively on those kinds of issues as well.
We usually like to hear when you've been here that we're better off than everybody else. No, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Mr. Gay?
No question, it just sounds like a very positive move for Tewksbury. I can't really see any downside to making this decision unless you have something you want to divulge, but
There are no negative repercussions that I'm aware of.
that's my point. So I think, for me, it sounds like something that Tewksbury is obviously should not use.
What on my right? Questions? And if I recall correctly, I think you came before our board just maybe a few years ago and presented this in its earlier stages, if I
Correct.
recall correctly. So at that time, we certainly endorsed it and adopted it at that level. So, all right, so if there are no further questions, Mr. Montori and his staff, with the help of representatives from NIMCOG, have put together a proposed plan with some clearly defined goals specific to the town of Tewksbury. And as has been requested, I would ask for a motion to adopt the plan as presented and recommended.
So moved, Jim.
Second.
All right, the motion was made by Mr. Gay, seconded by Mr. Wentworth. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the chair will vote in the affirmative as well. So we now have a hazard mitigation plan here in Tewksbury.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to invite you to stay right there, and if your colleague wants to join you from the back row.
I'm also going to have Tom Kennedy, our
Give a
consultant,
third.
join us
Yeah,
as well.
that's fine. Absolutely.
What's that?
Yeah, I don't think we,
No, I got another one. It's the same one you sent me earlier.
Correct.
all right, so I'm going to ask the three of you again, just for the record and those who are watching, just to identify yourselves. Obviously, Beverly, we've introduced you already this evening, but Mr. Donovan, if
Jay
you-
Donovan, Assistant Director of Northern Middlesex Council of Governments.
thank you. Welcome again. And sir?
Tom Kennedy from a company called CTC, and I'm here as a consultant working on the regional dispatch effort.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to the discussion. So, I'm going to ask the town manager if he wants to offer any opening comments, but before I do that, and I know there's a little bit of a presentation, let me just explain, and I know there's some interested parties sitting behind you, and others have contacted us expressing some interest in this subject matter. This decision, as I understand it, is governed by Chapter 500 of the Acts of 2014. And having read, spent some time with that statutory section relative to the potential establishment of a regional dispatch center. The discussion tonight, as described in the statute, essentially says that the local governing body here in Tewksbury, the Board of Selectmen, shall make the decision. So it really rests here. And there's nothing in the statute that suggests or mandates that this be treated as a public hearing. So I'm going to treat this like we do with other subject matter, more as a presentation as opposed to a public hearing. And what I mean by that is I'm going to ask the town manager to offer some comments. I'm going to have our guests present the information that they would like to present to us. And as a courtesy to those here from Tewksbury who are in the dispatcher ranks, as I believe there are a few of you here who may have some comments, I'm going to offer an opportunity for one of you to be their representative or spokesman. I don't know who that might be, but I'd like you to think about that as this discussion takes place, and if you have some comments from the vantage point of being a dispatcher here in Tewksbury, we certainly are interested in hearing that, but I want to limit that to one representative for the body, and hopefully that will give us, as a board, the full gamut or full picture from the varied perspectives that exist. So hopefully that will work well for us and for you. But I wanted to make that known at the outset so that you can get your thoughts together and think about who that person may be if in fact you will ask someone to represent your interests here in the discussion. So having said that, let me turn it over to the town manager for a few minutes, and maybe you can just kind of remind us or reboot where we left off last and what brought us to tonight.
Without going into too much in history, because I know it'll be covered in the PowerPoint presentation, this is something that's been going on since 2009, where the area communities have investigated the possibility of going to a regional emergency call center for dispatch. And over that time, we started off with many more communities than we have now, and through various discussions, studies, and review, some communities chose to withdraw from the process, others stayed in, and even as recent in the last few months, some communities decided that maybe it wasn't something they were interested in doing. So as of today, the towns of Chelmsford, Drake, and Tewksbury are the remaining three interested in regional dispatch. We believe that not only does it provide benefit financially, but it provides benefit from the standpoint of a state-of-the-art facility with better training to provide better service to the residents. Police Chief Tim Sheehan is here tonight, as well as the Fire Chief Hazel, who have been a part of the process even more in depth than myself, dating back to 2009, and they're here to answer any questions that.
Yeah, and I neglected to mention that. We want to give them an opportunity as well.
So all of the towns have had their public safety officials involved. We haven't had great discussion on this matter because it's changed so much over time. The last discussion I had with the board brought the information to the town would save some money. That's something we should continue to pursue. Bring your project for a presentation and answer any questions the board might have. But at some point, hopefully tonight, a decision needs to be made on moving forward and seeing the commitment from the community. So Jim Cogg's here tonight, Tom Kennedy, to make a presentation, answer any questions the board has. And as we go into this process more in depth, we in fact know that it's moving forward and we'll have discussions with personnel affected, instead of being affected by the plan. So I'll turn it over to Jay and Tom for the comment.
Sure.
Thank you. As the town manager mentioned, we initiated this project in 2009 at the request of the municipal managers and administrators to look at the feasibility of consolidating 911 dispatchers across our 9 communities. We applied for and received funding from the state 911 department to basically undertake a feasibility study, and that study concluded that the consolidation would improve the quality of service that our residents receive and would result in significant cost savings for the communities. At the conclusion of that study, there are a number of questions that remained unanswered regarding personnel issues, budgeting, where the facility would be located, and how it would be governed. We presented the feasibility study to the chief elected officials, and 7 of our 9 communities agreed to continue with the project into the implementation planning phase. We then applied for another grant for an implementation plan, and Richard, are you changing my slides?
Making sure everyone.
Thank you. And as part of that implementation plan, we looked at 9 potential sites for locating a regional facility. We prepared a draft intermunicipal agreement that would outline the governance of the facility and how the facility would operate. We did additional work on cost figures and budgeting and staffing plans in terms of what a facility for 7 communities might look like. And then each of those communities elected to continue with the study process at the conclusion of that phase. So we then, in 2014, applied for and received a professional services grant from the State 911 Department to look at the impact of Next Generation 911 on our call operations across the region and how that might play into a regional center. We wanted to look at the impact of sending all of the wireless calls to each community. Right now, if you dial 911 on your cell phone, your call is answered by the Essex Regional Emergency Communications Center. They basically take, if there's a major incident like a traffic accident on 495, they screen those calls and only one of those calls is transmitted to the town. And the regional center handles all of the others. The state really is looking in the future to be able to kind of send those calls either to the local communities or another regional center. As part of the process, we identified a preferred site for the Regional Emergency Communications Center, which I'll talk about later, but it's in Tewksbury. And we also investigated options for our very small communities. The towns of Tewksbury, Dunstable, and Peckrell expressed a desire to sort of consolidate their operations to similar size communities. Right now, they are, Groton and Dunstable have a relationship there where Groton is handling Dunstable's calls. And we basically have looked at some options for them that would allow them to either become part of the Neshoba Valley Regional Emergency Communications Center at Devens, or taking Peckrell and also joining that with the Groton facility that now handles Dunstable's calls. As part of this implementation plan update, we are, we've refined the financial information. We're sort of structured the intermunicipal agreement, which you have received a copy of, and looked in greater depth at the staffing plan. So at this point in time, it appears that the greatest interest is in a consolidation option that would include the communities of Chelmsford, Dracut, and Tewksbury, which is the information we're presenting tonight. So we've looked at the call volumes in each of those communities, and in 2014, collectively, there were almost 17,000 calls that were handled by the 3 communities combined. And if you look at the numbers, it's divided into wireless calls and wireline calls. And one of the wireline calls are your landline, basically. And one of the things that we've been seeing is that the trend over time is for there to be fewer landline calls and more wireless calls. And I think, you know, personally, we all know why that is, and we all have that experience. So in looking at the call volume, we also looked at the current personnel that are on duty in each of the individual dispatch centers in our communities. And in the 3 communities, there are 6 dispatchers on duty during the day shift, or actually the morning to afternoon shift, so 8 to 4, say. And then the afternoon shift, there are 6, and then the overnight shift, there are 5. We looked at the budgets for fiscal year 16 for each of our communities that are involved in this consolidation, and there are about $2 million budgeted collectively among the 3 communities. Most of that is in personnel costs, which is a big surprise. So taking into account the communities, the number of calls that they would be handling, what is currently, I think this is not the one I sent you most recently, Richard. We made some changes to the staffing amount that should have 1 executive director, 1 administrative assistant, 21 dispatchers, and 4.5 working supervised. So Under the proposed consolidated option for what we're calling the Northern Middlesex Regional Emergency Communications Center, we would propose to have 6 dispatchers on the day shift. 5 of those people would be dispatchers with 1 working supervisor who would be manning a console. There would be 6 on the evening shift, 5 dispatchers and 1 working supervisor, and 5 on the overnight shift, so that, and 1 supervisor. So when you look at these numbers and you compare them with what is manning the centers in each community and add them together, we're really suggesting that there be the same number of personnel on duty in a regional center as are now answering calls out in the community individually.
Can I just switch to the updated one?
Sure. Yep.
2 seconds.
Let's take a second.
So I guess that's what we're doing.
While he's doing that, one question to pose to you. When you looked at the budgets, it looked like there were pretty wide swings in the operating costs. Is that associated with the number of personnel involved largely, or are the compensation levels varied community to community?
I think that's more to do with the personnel and the fact that in some communities you have more senior personnel than in others. The town of Drakewood, for instance, uses a number of part-time dispatchers.
Yeah.
So it's more,
And you also had a footnote on one of the slides that I think it was Drakewood. They do some other work through their fire department.
the Drakewood Fire operates a secondary PSAP, and Tom can maybe talk a little bit more about how that works.
In general, what happens is that if a call comes in, goes into the police department, and if it's a fire or a emergency medical service call, that call is then dispatched. It's relayed to the fire dispatcher, and the fire dispatcher dispatches the appropriate equipment.
So the aggregate numbers, did they include that aspect of it or exclude the fire piece of it?
It doesn't.
It does. Thank you.